79, and I'm Bill Johnson. We're here at South Lake Tahoe in the Thomas F. Regan Beach area. Behind me is State Line, Nevada. You can probably see the casinos, Harrah's Club, Sahara Tahoe, and the Park Tahoe hotels. I have with me today Henry Butler, who has been coming to Lake Tahoe since 1922. And he's going to tell us about some of the experiences that the first time that he came to Tahoe, and his life at Tahoe from 1922 until 1979. I'd like to introduce to you now Henry Butler. Henry Butler and I have been friends for the last 20 years. We got acquainted when I was active in the Lake Valley Taxpayers Association. My family, of course, has been here a long time too, but he's been coming here longer than I have. And Henry, it's nice to have you with us today.
Well, I'm certainly happy to be here.
And I wonder if you'll tell us about your first experience coming to Lake Tahoe in 1922.
Well, I'll be happy to. You know, that was when I came here in 1922, I was 19 years old. And I'll begin to start working with Standard Oil. In those days, people worked 6 days a week, but Standard Oil had a little different system. They would let you, while they worked you 6 days a week, they would start you in the afternoon at 2 and put you off at 10 on the service stations, and then you go back the following morning at 6 to 2. So in practice, we'd have a half a day, and then we'd have a full day off, then we'd have it all the other following morning. So it was really very nice for a young fellow with a car. And my pal had a Model A Roadster, and he was a good driver, and I was pretty good myself. So we traveled all over Northern California, many parts. We had never been to Tahoe. We'd heard of this mysterious lake high up in the Sierra where nobody ever went. And we decided at last we would explore that lake. So in June 1922, about the middle of it, we heard the road was open. We could go over the Sierras. In those days, there were no snow plows on the passes, and you only got through for 3 or 4 or 5 months of the year, depending on the snowfall, how late the snow came and how early it came in the fall. Well, anyway, we started out around noon. We got off a little early, had our friends take our place at the stations. And we started out from Oakland. We went to every town. In those days, the highways were narrow, and they went to every little town that was available. We went through, I can't think of all the little towns, until we got to the Carquinez Straits. In those days, there was no bridge across the straits. There was a ferry operating. And they ran about every half hour, so we arrived at the ferry building, at the ferry, and got on the ferry and ferried across the Carquinez Straits, and then they drove it down into the town of Vallejo. They didn't try to bypass towns. The towns were very jealous in those days. They wanted the highway traffic to go through so they could get the business. So we went through Vallejo, then we went up a few miles north, and eventually worked our way through all the little towns like Dixon and Davis and Vacaville. And around 4 o'clock we came to the Yolo Bypass. That had only been built since 1917. Previous to that time, people went to Sacramento, primarily on boats, although in the summertime when it was dry, you could get across the Yolo Bypass. They had a 2-lane concrete highway raised up about 20 feet or 15 feet above the level of where the water would be. And most of the year, that was underwater. We arrived in Sacramento somewhere about 4:30 or 4:45, went right on through. We didn't stop for a thing. Fast as we could go. I think the speed limit in those days was 35 miles an hour, and I'm not quite sure. It was around very close to that. The highway was extended out from Sacramento to Placerville, and with the speed limit of that sort, and the kind of roads they had, and often having to get off the road to pass somebody, so that there wasn't enough room on the highway for two cars to pass. We arrived at Placerville sometime around 6 o'clock or 6:30. I don't know what. I think it's the sunset. We didn't have any daylight saving in those days. And we arrived there just about sunset. So we got our dinner in Placerville. I think the dinners were 35 or 50 cents a piece. Not very much. The meals and things were cheap, and the wages were low in those days. And then we drove out a mile out of town to find a place where we could put our beds up, and we went to bed at sunset. And I remember next morning the sun was rising, and we got up at sunrise, which was somewhere around 6 o'clock. I think the sun rose around 5:30 in those days, with no daylight saving. So we went down, had breakfast, then we started up the climb. No more highway. We left Placerville on a gravelly road. Apparently we had very little traffic. We climbed and we climbed and we climbed. Very poor road. And we'd passed one little hamlet after another, what there was on the highway. There weren't very many of them in those days. And around 2 o'clock, about around 12 o'clock, we reached the summit. And the car, of course, boiled all the way, and the roads, of course, were up and down. They could go up a grade, and they would go down in a gully, and then they would go around the floor. The roads weren't cut straight. They took the course of least resistance, and it was a slow process getting up there. But as I say, we reached the summit at last, around 12, and then we started to go down the grade. In those days, the road, you can still see it. There's a trestle under the S3 tracks at near the summit, and the cars would go down. I understand that some of the cars were afraid of their brakes were burning up. They would put a entire log to the back of their car, acting as an extra breakage on the car to get down the grade so they wouldn't burn their brakes out. Well, we didn't have to do that before. The Ford brakes did hold up pretty well. And last of all, we got down to a lower level, and then we drove along by Donner Lake. We saw the monument there, and eventually we got into Truckee around 2 o'clock and had our lunch, another 35 or 50 cent meal, and satisfied as well. Then we left Truckee and took the narrow road down towards Tahoe City. In those days, there was a train track running to Tahoe City from Truckee, but it was a narrow gauge railroad run by the Pacific. The Southern Pacific had a large hotel. It was one of the 15 or 20 hotels that the Southern Pacific had built in California, such as the one at Del Monte, San Diego, and many other parts of California. They had one at Truckee, at Tahoe City. This is open in the summertime. Well, we got down to Tahoe City around 3. It took us about an hour to make the distance there. And we couldn't drive very fast. The road was narrow and rougher, but we looked around the country. And then we took the west side road and drove along what is now, what is the name of some of those areas over there?
On the west side, like
side.
Homewood, Tacoma.
Yeah, Tacoma. And
Beach
there was another,
Bay.
yeah, there were 2 or 3 places in there for camper. Not many people came to Tahoe because it was so difficult to get to. Lucky Baldwin had a large hotel up here at the southern end of the lake, but I don't think that was in operation in those days. Anyway, we didn't have enough money to go to a hotel for the kids. So basically we got down towards where, we got down to where near the road in those days went around, and there was no road between between what we would call the Y today, except to the marshes. That is the Trout Creek marshes. It was a road that was used in the summertime that came up to Bijou and State Line. Well, we took that road, and leaving the area there where the present Y is, there was no Lamson store there. There was nothing else at all. No school, no nothing. They didn't come till 1932. Then we got down to Myers at last, which was the big center in this area, and what was the name of the people that out there?
Celio.
The Celios operated the store there. And of course, it was the place to load up with gas. We knew we had to climb the Myers grade. That was quite a feat in those days. A steep one-way road with little turnouts, so we could get by we could pass when necessary. And of course, there are several streams running across the road, spots, and we would stop and load our old Ford up with water, and it was boiling all the way up the grade. Boil, boil, boil. But eventually we got up to near the top, when it was a zigzag. You can still see it today. The roads there are paved. If you leave the highway, you go up to the summit there, where the lookout station is, and you can see what kind of a road we had, although in those days, no paving, just rough surface. Eventually we got to the top. And after we got to the top, the driving was easy. Of course, Ford only had a low gear and a high gear. Then we got into high gear up there. We started going down the dirt road. And we went hell-bent for election. We went as fast as we could go, which wasn't very fast in those days. We were faster than anybody else because the roads were dirty and dusty. The clouds of dust were arrived, particularly further down the road where it was red. The clouds of dust were just hard to believe. But we would get ahead of the traffic in front of us until we could have a clear road. We didn't meet very much traffic. Well, we drove on and on and on, hit the few little areas in there where they had gas. There were quite a few stopping places along the road where you could buy food, and such as Fred's Place, and I don't remember all the spots. They've all disappeared now, but in those days, about every 5 or 6 miles, there was a place where you could buy a few things, get gasoline and water for your car, particularly for those coming up the grade. It was boiling and boiling. Well, 9 o'clock, we got into Placerville. So we had dinner there, another 50-cent meal. And we heard then that the ferry closed down at 2 o'clock, going across the Carquinez Straits. So we knew we wouldn't go down the Carquinez Straits from across the causeway. So when we hit Sacramento, we turned south, and the highway then carried was on the top of the levees. The levees were more noticeable then than they are today. And the highway was on top of the levee. It was a paved highway, I believe. I think it was. We got into Stockton around probably 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. And probably loaded up with gas. And then we left Stockton for Tracy. And then at Tracy, we turned off towards Oakland and came up the Ultimate Pass. And the wind was blowing. It was quite a strong wind. And we had to go into low gear to get over the Ultimate Pass. The wind blew against the car. Even though it was a roadster with the top down, there was a lot of resistance. It was a hard trip up the grade. Eventually, we got to the top of the Ultimate. We coasted, and then we could go along pretty smoothly till we get down again. Got into the East Bay area. And I remember that morning we arrived home around 6 o'clock or 6:30. 6 o'clock, I guess it was, and the sun was just coming over the Berkeley Hills and the Oakland Hills. And we took our luggage off and we said goodbye. My friend went up the road where he lived a mile away up to Claremont Avenue, to the Claremont Hotel. And I lived near the Shasta and College. And that was an end of an adventurous trip. And you know, I was so fascinated with the lake that a few weeks later, I took my own car, I took my mother and a couple of friends, and we came up here and we stayed 4 or 5 days around the lake. We camped over at Camp Richardson. There was no Camp Richardson in those days. That was before Richardson had bought the property. But the Lucky Baldwin Hotel was there, but it wasn't in operation. And we got our drinking water out of the lake, and we camped on the beach and made a fire. We could do our cooking, although we did have a gasoline stove. From there, the 2 days we were here, we went out and went over to Lakeside and saw whatever. And then when we went back, we went down the old Lincoln Highway, it was called in those days, now known as Pioneer Trail. And the road was the bumpiest road I ever saw. Until they paved it, was still one of the worst roads I've ever seen. Eventually we went over that, we got back to Myers, and then from Myers we'd go back to Camp Richardson, what was now known as Camp Richardson, where we were on the lake. And 4 or 5 days, I say, we were here, then we drove our way back to Oakland. But in general, it took most people a full day of hard driving to get from Oakland to Tahoe. And many people would stay at Pacific House for the night or somewhere else along the road. There were taverns along the road where they would stay for the evening and come make a 2-day trip out of it, getting to Tahoe. And once they got here, they didn't leave. They didn't run over to Reno, and you didn't go down to Carson Valley or places like that. It was actually several years later before I went down to Carson Valley for the first time. I went down the Myers grade. I mean the Kingsbury grade, down to the Carson Valley, and boy, that was a steep grade in those days. One thing I do remember seeing down at Minden in those days, along in 25 and 26, you'd see Indians coming around. They were papooses on their back. There were a lot of Indians around. I don't see any Indians anymore when I go down there, but in those days there were lots of Indians around. And it was quite interesting to see them with the papooses going around the area. I guess, Bill, you remember that, don't you?
Oh, yes. When you were making these trips from Berkeley to Tahoe in the 20s, wasn't tires a problem because the roads were poor and rough? And
I was very lucky. We had no trouble with that Ford on our tires, and my other cars gave us very little trouble. I guess people did have a lot of tire trouble. And there's one thing I forgot to tell you about. Every year they'd fix a piece of the road, but they'd always pick the worst piece first, but they didn't start till about 1927 or 28 to build the highway between Placerville and Tahoe. And the worst piece of the road was a piece of Strawberry. The road, in those days, the road which we now take up, turn to the left and go up around the curve there, which is nicely paved. You graduate a long way. We went up the canyon, the American River Canyon, went straight ahead, and they had, in past years, they'd taken the boulders out of the stream. It was really a stream bed. They blasted them, broke them up, and it was a one-way road. A lot of cars could not make it. It was so steep that a lot of cars could not make that road. So the AAA kept a Fierce Arrow tow truck there. The Fierce Arrow was the biggest passenger car made in the United States in those days. And sometime when they wrecked them, they would turn them into tow trucks. So the AAA kept this tow car there. And for $10, they would tow you up the grade, or for $10, they would sell you a membership in the AAA, and then with that membership, you were entitled to be dragged up the grade. So you had your choice. Of course, everybody bought a membership for $10.
You're talking about the area by Twin Bridges and what was commonly known in the early days as Slippery Ford.
That was right, Slippery Ford grade it was called. And it was a terrible grade, and people just didn't come up there because they couldn't stand it. If the AAA was not there to take care of all the cars, they never got up the grade. My Dodge, which I owned, went up the grade okay. It was a very efficient car, but it certainly didn't apply to all the cars. I think those are the high spots of the lake. There are one or two things I'd like to add about the cost of property. I live in Tahoe Meadows, and the lots were laid out in those days in 100-foot frontages on the beach.
Well, before you get to, why don't you tell us when the Tahoe Meadows subdivision was laid out and when your family and you acquired property there?
Well, the Tahoe Meadows subdivision was laid out in 1920 by Butler and Kimball, and people didn't come to Tahoe. It was really hard to sell real estate. And the only people they could get to come up here were people who taught in the schools or the professors. And there were a lot of professors in Tahoe Meadows, and they formed a little trailer on. They formed a little club. The Butler and Kimball sold lots on the beach, and a 100-foot lot, when they first sold them in 22, 23, 24, was sold for $200 a piece. There was one lot in it. There were two lots in there. They were 80-foot frontage, and I know the people who bought one of those lots, and they held them all those years till last year. And the family died out and left the property to Stanford University. They did put a very small cabin on the property, and the property which they'd probably paid $160 for the 80-foot lot sold for $175,000. That shows you how pre-property exchanged hands, how it's increased. And of course, there's only so much beach property, and there's no more, never will be any more. And it's in big demand. It isn't a paying proposition to own it, but there's a lot of pride in owning a beach lot. I paid $570 for the 2 acres that I have, or approximately 2 acres that I have in Tahoe Meadow, which is the biggest beach in Tahoe Meadow, but it's near the highway. Actually, I couldn't have lived at the beach, living on the beach. It's not a very pleasant place with the wind blowing all the time. But we were back in the woods and very comfortable. And I moved up here permanently. My mother purchased a lot in 1928 for $500. We came up every summer, camped on the lot, and then in 1937 I built my first house there. And then I liked it so. In 1939 we moved up here, and I put some more additions on, made some improvements. And I stayed here through the war because I had an apartment house in Oakland. I couldn't get my apartment back where I rented it out due to government regulations for housing. And I didn't mind staying up here, and I was refused by the draft board for the Army services. So it didn't matter, but I don't think there were 100 people in the lake area in the wintertime. And the roads previous to 1936 had always been closed from state line into California. But in 1936, the state of California hired the state of Nevada, which had kept the road open to state line. They hired them to plow the road from state line to Camp Richardson, where the post office was there, and there was some other reason. I think it's the forestry department had something there that they wanted to get to. So the road went down, was plowed on a 2-lane highway from the state line to Lampson's and the Y, and down to Camp Richardson. The road from the Y wasn't opened up till 1941. 1941 was the first year that they went over the summit. The road was opened in 1941, a 2-lane highway, and then they closed the road down in 1942 when the war was on because nobody was using it, and didn't open it up again until 1946. And after that, the road has been kept open most of the time, except in the great snows of '52, when we had the greatest snowfall we ever had. The road was closed for 30 days because of the slides. Then they eventually got it open, and since then the road has been fine condition. They've improved it each year, and they still are improving the road. Let's see if anything else would be.
Well, of course, you were married in the intervening time.
Yes, I was married in 1943.
And eventually had a son named Randy, and
yes.
Was Randy educated here?
Yeah, Randy spent the first 7 grades up here.
First 7 grades, and then what?
Then I sent him to San Rafael Military Academy for 5 years, and from then on he went over to the CAD, graduated from Cal, and graduated as a law student at Spokane, and he just graduated from New York University, and he got his master's degree in law there. So that's roughly our story.
Well, I know that you were interested in since you lived here permanently from 1937 to date, and I remember I was married in 1953 and came to live at Tahoe permanently after that, and you've been interested in the medical help and facilities. And I remember when I was first married and moved here, there was only doctors in the summertime who came from Sacramento. Would you kind of review the medical history?
Yes, there was only one doctor that came up here that I know of that came over and stayed in Tahoe. And he was up here from May to, I can't think of the name? Do you remember the name of those doctors?
Haddon, wasn't it? Dr. Haddon.
Haddon, they came up here, and they always had somebody here. So when we were ill, and so forth, fortunately we had awfully good health. My wife and my mother and myself had good health. We needed them very seldom. One occasion we had to go down, and they were there. And then after the war, people felt like they should have a doctor, but doctors would not come here because there was no hospital handy, and there was no facilities for them that they had. They felt they couldn't make a living. So to encourage a doctor to come, we raised money around here by having big parties. First of all, we had a big party at Harvey's. Harvey was very good. I think we raised about $5,000 there. And a big party we had, and everybody chimed in. We had a lot of fun doing this. And then we had a harp party over at what is now known as Harris, but in those days, the State Line Country Club. They had a party. I think Harvey had another one for it. I think there were two. Harvey was a big booster for it. And eventually, we raised about $20,000. And then we got some other pledges, and we built what is known as Tahoe Medical Clinic. It's now owned by the city of South Lake Tahoe. What do they have in there, Bill?
They have their administrative offices there, the city clerk and the city manager and various offices. The city attorney are presently housed there. I might point out that the county still owns the property, but we lease it to the city for $1 a year.
I can't think, what else should we tell them?
Well, I think we have to go ahead and tell that we entice the doctors to come here by building this building. And
we gave them the rent for about $300 a month, which was a very low rent. With that, we were able to pay off the rest of our indebtedness. And the doctors prospered around here. Dr. Janice came and Dr. Whiteley, they were partnerships, and they used the building, and they took care of all the deliveries around here, babies and anything else. And I guess in the past, many a man had died on the highway trying to get down to Carson. There was no hospital in Carson in those days. They had to get to Reno. So it was a serious case. Not very many of them survived. Previous to that, we'd had an ambulance here. Fire Chief Shaw ran the ambulance and operated it, and he said he used to sell tickets around here for some $15 or $20 a family. Anybody was entitled to use that ambulance to get down to the hospital in Reno at first, and then later on in Carson when they built a hospital. And then, of course, eventually, we got the hospital built up here in 1963, I believe it was. I've been a director of the hospital ever since it's been in operation. And we've had the board there, a few of the original ones by Neil Olson, and Dr. Whiteley are still here. And we raised funds, we put on campaigns, and sold memberships, family memberships for $1,000, and we were able to raise quite a lot of money. And eventually when we sold the Tahoe Medical Clinic building, we gave the hospital that. And although we went into debt, eventually, we've always been in debt at the hospital, but we were able to survive, and the hospital today is really doing very well.
I think we ought to point out that another old-time family from Tahoe, where they were actually cattle ranchers from the Folsom area, gave the property for the hospital site.
Yes. The Barton family gave us the hospital. That is why known as the Barton Memorial Hospital. They gave us the 6 acres there, and it was very nice for them to do that, and we didn't have the problem of buying land, and it's turned out to be a good location, and we're well satisfied with it.
When you came here permanently in the 30s, of course, you pointed out that the roads weren't kept open in the wintertime and so forth, but did you visualize the growth that would take place
I
in the
couldn't have
immediate
foreseen
30
the
years?
growth because people never came here in the past. But what's made Tahoe is the gambling. That's the thing that brings people to Tahoe because of the food, the entertainment, and all that goes with it, and the lights, the neon lights. In the past, all you could do of an evening, I remember all you could do was have a campfire and sit around and sing. But that got rather boresome, although when I did camp over at Lakeside in the early 20s, we would have campfires there, and all the campers would get around. We'd get together and drag up wood. There's plenty of dead wood around, and we'd drag it up and have a campfire for 2 or 3 hours every evening, sing songs, and there was somebody there usually who sang. In those days, people sang a lot more in the school. School children sang, but they don't seem to do that anymore at school. Life is different. But we did it, and that was our form of entertainment. We went to bed early and got up early. I know the first thing I did when I got out of bed in the morning, which when I was at Lakeside, was run down to the lake and jump in and swim for half an hour. And then we'd come back and eat breakfast. And you had a good appetite out of that cold water, I'll tell you. And then we'd lay on the beach all day. There was really nothing to do here. There were no horses to hire. And matter of fact, there wasn't a movie around till late on. The Young Brothers at one time tried to run a movie at Al Tahoe, but it wasn't too successful. And then after the war, people began to come in here. We had a population of 500. We thought it was fabulous. And then Armstrong came up, opened the subdivision up, and sold lots down here, used high-powered methods and sold lots, $1 down, $1 a week. was a killer gun. And the way the cruiser stages increased in value is just fabulous. I've heard of people paying $400 or $500 for a lot, selling it out for $70,000, $80,000 on State Line and Lakeside, on the highway in that area there. And that, of course, applied to all the property until the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency came in and ruined all the values around here for the subdividers. There's been no more subdivisions since they came in. Let's see what else.
Let's take a break for now, Ross.
What else is there?
I'd like to continue with our second segment of our interview with Henry R. Butler, discussing early days at Lake Tahoe. Again, we're on the Thomas F. Regan beach area, and this area was known to us who have been here for a long time as the Globin Beach. And just out behind us here was a very long pier, and the purpose of this pier, of course, was to go out to the deep water, so the boats that went around the lake carrying passengers and mail in the early days had a place to stop without being grounded. Also in this area was built a very large chalet, was used for dancing and that type of entertainment. And I don't remember the boat very well, but Henry, I know you do, because you've been here so long. Would you tell us a little bit about the boat?
Yeah, the boat was, I imagine, the amount of 100 feet long. It was a very good sized boat they had on it, known as Lake Tahoe. And in the wintertime, it came here 3 times a week. And they would deposit the mail. What really kept the boat going was the subsidy the government gave for delivering the mail. It was far above what it was, they paid an awful price for it, but the boat did come. And they would stop at every little resort, like 8 or 9 stops. They stop at Camp Richardson at this end of the lake, and I suppose they stopped at all the others. Then they stop at Al Tahoe. They'd stop at the Bijou, where the Young brothers had the store. And then they stop at Lakeside, and they would deliver the mail there and the papers. And they went down to Glenbrook. And from Glenbrook, I don't believe they stopped anywhere. They went back. They cut right across the lake and went back to Tahoe City. And it was quite a sight. And in the summertime, the boat ran every day, and they brought tourists around. But the roads were improved, and then they put a tunnel through the Cave Rock. And after the tunnel got through, and Nevada built some better roads, they gave a contract to a stage. And of course, the boat people who lost the contract was very lucrative and paid the way of the boat. They couldn't operate a boat without that contract, so they stopped running the boats on Lake Tahoe. That was the end of the boat thing. And the stages delivered the mail. The stages came in here every day, and that's why we got it. The boat stayed. They kept the boats up here till 1941. In 1941, Bill Ham, who was an old timer here, had come up here somewhere about 1918 or 19. Went out there and opened up the cockpit. Who are the people that owned alcohol? Bliss's owned the boat, and they opened up the cockpit and they dropped the boat. They tell me if you go down 400 feet, you can see the boat is down there. They have something to detect it. They know where it is, and they can find that boat down. It's probably in a pretty good state of preservation in that cold water. There's been talk of raising the boat, but they never have raised it as yet.
Henry, as a young man, I remember that there were 3 or 4 very prominent people here. They owned the resorts and were the business people. The first set of those was probably Charlie and Wilt Young, who were brothers, who had been born over in Genoa, but came up here and ran a resort called Young Bijou. Did you remember them?
I remember them very well. I knew Charlie and I know Wilt. And they were up here, as far as I know, they stayed up here all the year round, but probably in their early childhood they did live down. They moved out in the wintertime, but I know probably from 1900 on, I'm sure that they stayed here in those winters. And well, nobody came through. They just watched their property. And when they did go out, they went out by means of the boat. And the other people here were Richardson. Richardson came up in 1924 and started Camp Richardson down here. And he built that place up now, which is owned by the United States Forestry Department. And the other individual was Glover, who came up here also in 1920, where he gone bankrupt in Sacramento. And they moved up here, and he opened up a store and a resort, and apparently prospered up here. I remember the time when the basement was full of slot machines in Glover's place, because they didn't enforce the law. But when one of the California governors really enforced the law, he had to pull them out, and they took them over to Nevada. And then the other remaining individual was Lamson, who came up here in 1931, opened a store at the Y, and he built a store there and a house, and he lived there till he died in 1952. And they ran the country around here. They lined up the boaters before the elections. At the time when the election was very close, they could really swing an election. I'm sure they stuffed the ballot boxes. There's nobody here to watch it. And they all worked together. That's what they did. Life was different. This was an outlaw country up there in those days. Brenzo was the sheriff. That was the only law in the country. And the roads were closed over the summit, so you had to go into Nevada. I remember once they used to get the sheriff to come up after 1931 when the gambling was legalized in Nevada. They had one telephone down to Minden. And I went up there. I think this is a little interesting story. I had two visitors come up with John Bond and a couple of lawyers came up and stayed with my place for a couple of days. So the only thing you could do after gambling was legalized, there were only 2 or 3 clubs. There was the Nevada Club owned by Beecher and a couple of others which were closed down, Straight Line Country Club. That was before, at that time there was no Harvey's Club. That was owned by the Episcopalian Church and there's church grounds there. That evening along in 1941, 1941, I went up there and it seemed awfully quiet around the Nevada Club. And when we got near the place, we could see the doors were locked, and we went up, we looked in. Laying on the floor, there were 2 guys laying out coal on the floor. It was dead coal. The crap table was turned over, and I found out later that 3 or 4 cowboys, they were kind of smart guy, Alex, and they came up here and they were going to win. And they'd played the game, and it didn't take them very long to lose all the money. So they began to act up pretty smart. They tipped the tables over then, but those croupiers were ready for it. They had the blackjacks, they knocked him over the head, and they knocked him out cold. They had 2 of them knocked out cold. The other one, they had the custody with the guy who was holding a shotgun when I had it, and keeping him under order. And then they phoned down. They had the only phone down to Minden. They phoned down to the sheriff to come up and pick him up. And after a while, the sheriff came up and hauled him away in a truck. The one brought cold, the rest of them took him down to Minden and locked him up. But life was certainly different. The 2 clubs, the clubs we had, didn't play up the food game like they do today. They just had, Beecher ran Beecher says, I'm not going to run a carnival up here, I'm going to run a straight gambling game. That's what he did, a bar, he had gambling tables, but no food involved. And he stayed open all the year. It wasn't from 1944 that Harvey opened up and stayed open all the year when he purchased the property. And I think that's another little interesting point. There were 7 acres there where the Episcopalian Church owned, and they'd want to sell it very bad. They didn't want to be near the gambling houses. So they were looking for a buyer, and Harvey Gross heard it was for sale. He didn't have enough money to buy it. So he got Ken Johnson, who had a gambling house down in Carson, and he put up the difference. And between them, they bought the 7 acres for $25,000. They split it up. Harvey took part, which he owns today, owned originally, and then Ken Johnson had the other half, which was actually on the corner and very deep, about 3 acres. More parking. Harvey had more frontage, but not so much parking. He didn't need much parking in those days. Well, eventually, Harvey, then Harrah had a contract when he came back. He had an option to purchase some ridiculous price. But he exercised his option with much to the disgust of Johnson. He bought the property, I understand, for around $200,000, which is a terrible price. But Harrah owned it, and believe it or not, about 7 or 8 years ago, Harrah sold the property, which you can see in the Quonset hut, for 3.5 acres. He sold it to Harvey for $4,350,000 cash for the barrelhead. That's the finest piece of increase of profit I've ever heard of.
Well, I think that we have another similar instance where there has not been a club built, and that's the Jennings property.
I don't know the story.
I understand that he purchased that about 7 years ago for $150,000, and has been trying to build a casino there, and of course has gone through all kinds of legal maneuvers in which to attempt to do that. And now he has won his court battles, and the federal government has just recently passed a bill authorizing $12.5 million to purchase that piece of property.
I believe that's correct. There's been some fabulous increases around here, places on real estate. People have held it for a long time.
It's also interesting. I can remember. Don't remember the dates, but in the early days there was no bank here, and the banking for the resorts, especially in the summertime, was somewhat of a problem. Do you recall any of those?
I didn't run into that very much because I wasn't in business here. Since I began to make real estate loans here, and even before the war, there was so little turnover of property. There wasn't much sure what it was. I could probably get. The banks didn't make loans, the bill says, and there were no savings loans. It was a long trip down to Carson, but they seemed to get by, and I never heard of any big robberies here in those days.
No, I don't recall of any, but I do remember there was somewhat of inconvenience. I remember the Young brothers used to do their banking in Carson City. My family did their banking in the farmer's bank of Carson Valley down in Minden. Of course, it wasn't a problem for us because we went back and forth probably every other week because of the ranching operations we carried on in Carson Valley.
Well, look, gambling was so lucrative that the people, the several owners that own the State Line Country Club, which is now part of Harrah's, they would only open it up 6 weeks of the year. They'd open up from July the 15th to August to Labor Day, and they could make a good living out of it in that short period. Show you how lucrative gambling. And all these gamblers up here, Harvey Gross went broke sometime in the early 40s, before he came up here, and Harrah was no better. And those boys have made $1 million. I think Harrah the state has to pay $100 million inheritance tax on his estate, and having a hard time raising the cash to do that. But they're going to have to do it, of course. It shows you how lucrative. He built it all out of earnings from the losers.
Henry, I want to thank you for taking these few minutes with us to discuss the early day history of Tahoe, and perhaps at a later date we can do another taping with the things that we forgot to discuss today.
Well, there's probably a lot of things that I've forgotten, Bill.
Right.
Well, Bill, it's been a pleasure telling you this, what I know, and I've lived through, and it's been an interesting life up here. I've been a pioneer in this country when there was practically nobody here, not very many houses around. I've seen the place grow up to where it is now, 25 or 30,000 population in winter. It's been an interesting experience in my life to go through that. I wouldn't have missed it. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Tahoe has always fascinated me. I've never tired of the place. I would never gone back to the city. Of course, now it's 76. I can't go anywhere. But as I say, it's a great life.
So good.